Joining me now are three MPs from the different parties. Greg Fergus is a Parliamentary Secretary and the Liberal MP for the Quebec riding of Hull-Aylmer. Shannon Stubbs is a Conservative MP for the Alberta riding of Lakeland and her party's public safety critic. And Don Davies is the NDP health critic and the MP for the riding of Vancouver-Kingsway. All three of you, thanks for joining us.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.
Okay, I want to start with what was very much in the news yet again this week, and that is Greg Fergus. Doug Ford, again, in Ontario, reiterated what he says are basic measures that Ottawa is not doing, and he is again requesting, and I think his fourth letter to Ottawa, mandatory PCR testing of all domestic air travelers, tighter restrictions on international travel, mandatory quarantine hotel stays for people arriving at the land border. You know these three requests. Why hasn't Ottawa moved on these three specific requests yet?
Well, I think Ottawa is always ready to play a role to be supportive of the provinces, and especially of Ontario, as they're having some difficulty dealing with the COVID-19, the third wave of the break. As a result, on the international side of things, which is what the federal government plays a role in, we've been speaking with Ontario, and we're trying to identify which travelers that they would like us to stop bringing into this country, whether if they're international students or with international healthcare workers. We can do that, and we can work with them on that front. On the interprovincial side of things, of course, as we've seen with the Atlantic bubble, that's very much provincial jurisdiction. But in that effort, we're still there. We're still ready to help, and we have millions of PCR tests that we've given to Ontario. We'd be happy to supply them with more, and we're there to try to help them in any way possible. I live in a border community. My riding is on the border of Quebec and Ontario. So we've seen that when the Ontario government has put in border controls to try to discourage non-essential travel across the border. So we know that that's possible, and we're happy to work with them.
Okay, what about
the
third request, and that was, and this is probably their first request that they made, and that was actually imposing quarantine hotels, a 3-day quarantine hotel stay for people crossing at the land border between the Canada and the U.S. The federal government's position on that?
Well, again, we'd have to take a look at that. I mean, the reality is less than, in the case of Ontario, less than 1% of COVID infections are a result of international cross-border travel, plane and a car included. It's easier to do it on planes, obviously, because there are a limited number of entries into Canada by airport. By car borders, of course, there's many dozens, I should say, of land entries. And then we would have to try to figure out the logistics of getting people to specialized hotels that can quarantine them properly for that time.
Is it safe to say that the federal government is looking askance at that proposal because of the logistics? Because we've heard no response to it.
I think it's fair to say that we're looking at the proposal, and we're looking at it very carefully with our officials.
Okay. Shannon Stubbs, is your party in favour of all of these things that Ontario Premier Doug Ford is requesting? For example, also is the Conservative Party of Canada in favour of the mandatory quarantine hotels at land crossings? You have a border in Alberta with Montana, mandatory hotel stays at land crossings?
Well, here's the first thing I would say, Martin. I think that it's most Canadians are probably wondering how it could be a year and a half into this and how it could be the case that the federal government hasn't actually established certainty and clarity on a whole number of fronts, that all of which include having secured sufficient vaccine supply. We're behind our allies and 86 in the world in terms of vaccinations per percentage of the population. There's still to this moment no consistent, clear national pre and post arrival rapid testing system, which Conservatives have been calling for since last January. And here we are now talking about this quarantine program, which has been rife with problems and inconsistently applied. And as you know, Conservatives have called for a mandatory end to this program on two grounds. One is this. First of all, officials and the government have never, ever provided the evidence, the science, the rationale that they have used to make this decision to implement this quarantine program.
So you're not in favor then? Okay, so you're not in favor of the Ontario proposal about mandatory quarantine hotels?
I think that premiers of every province are making all kinds of demands of the federal government. They're having to make extremely difficult decisions. But the reality is they've been forced into that position because of the Trudeau Liberals' failures on borders, on vaccine supply, and on pre- and post-arrival rapid testing.
Okay, Don Davies, what do you make? I mean, the reason we're bringing this up is that the Ontario Premier is persisting he's now sent 4 letters to the federal government. So just on the Ontario request, what do you make of what's going on between Ontario and the federal government?
Well, I think there's 2 fundamental issues that need to be clearly understood, and frankly, there's a lot of myth-making and misleading information. Number one is the federal government has primary jurisdiction to deal with emergencies. At Health Committee right now, we're studying this very issue, and we're hearing from constitutional experts. There's 100% agreement that it's the federal government in a time of emergency that has the constitutional authority to act. Number 2, this nonsense line that we have the strongest border controls in the world has to be punctured. Okay, first and foremost, how do you have a hotel quarantine rule? And leaving aside whether it's good or bad, the federal Liberals brought it in, but they only apply it to passengers arriving by air. It's tens of thousands of people are getting around that by simply flying to U.S. border towns and crossing by vehicle. Number 2, we know that at 2 of the 4 airports that are allowing international travelers in this country, the provinces are not even enforcing any federal quarantine rules. That's in Alberta and Quebec. Finally, CBSA is not even asking international passengers coming from the States whether they've been vaccinated or not. It's a prime time to get that data. Look, since the start, we've been focused on international flights, but only 1 in 7 flights in this country is international. 85% of the air traffic in this country originates to and from Canadian cities. So tens of thousands of Canadians are traveling across Canada every week with effectively no testing or quarantine. And data is showing that that's how we're spreading variants from region to region. And the federal government has the jurisdiction, they're the only authority of government that has the jurisdiction to enforce interprovincial travel guidelines or rules. And they haven't done that. And we're seeing spread of transmission of COVID because of that.
Okay, Greg Fergus, as you mentioned, you're on the Ontario-Quebec border. We did hear Quebec Premier François Legault at one point also expressing concerns about the Trudeau Airport in Montreal. And as Don Davies just mentions, this is primarily a federal jurisdiction when it comes to interprovincial travel. Do you think your government is coming under increasing pressure to try and bring in a national standard for testing for interprovincial travel by airplane?
With all due respect to my colleague, Mr. Davies, that's actually not the case. The provinces do play a very big role on interprovincial travel, and then provinces can determine whether or not they're going to let people cross over the border.
But would it not be beneficial to have a federal standard?
We saw this with the Atlantic bubble, which very successfully has worked for the Atlantic provinces where their caseload is extremely low. It helped in Quebec when we did establish different lockdowns, different very serious lockdowns to bring down our numbers. We haven't been hit by the 3rd wave as other provinces have been hit. Right. So, I mean, there are ways that provinces should exercise their jurisdiction, and we're happy to play a role with them when they want us to play that role. If Ontario is looking for us to play that role, we'll be happy to join them in doing so.
But the Prime Minister has repeatedly said that the federal government is there for you. That's his words to the province.
Exactly right.
Is the federal government there in terms of setting a leadership role or a guidance, or a national standard in terms of testing at airports for interprovincial air travel?
With the level of coordination which is going on between the provinces and the federal government and municipalities and health authorities, we don't feel that there is a need for us to play the big parent role and impose a made in Ottawa solution. The provinces are not, certainly there's no consensus among provinces for us to play that kind of a role.
Shannon Stubbs, just a last word to you in terms of, in the spirit of being constructive, what do you think the highest priority is, if you have to choose one thing, highest priority for next action in terms of this pandemic?
I would say the highest priority for the federal government is to provide clarity, consistency, and certainty on their border measures, as well as a data-driven plan towards reopening Canada. Here's the thing. We're having this conversation right now about politicians and governments back and forth together. But what we really should be talking about is the impact this has had on Canadian lives. And so here's the reality. A Canadian either landing at an airport or traveling across the border gets totally contradictory information from PHAC, from CBSA, from the Department of Transport. Our own MPs' offices following up with ministers and department officials on behalf of our constituents get different answers. This is having a major impact on individual Canadians, their livelihoods, their families, in some cases, their health for people who have traveled for medical necessities, and also on jobs and businesses. So this is what the Liberals have got to get right. They've got to provide certainty, clarity, and consistency on border measures and on the path to reopening.
We're running out of time. I don't mean to cut you all off, but we're running out of time. A last word to you, Don Davies. If you had to choose one priority, just in a few words, what do you think it would be?
Well, I think we have to take a look at interprovincial rules. You know, there was in a 2-week period they found that an average of 17 flights a day between Canadian cities had at least one passenger testing positive. It doesn't make any sense to test people who are coming from out of the country, but not do that within our country. And the temperature checks have proved ineffective at catching COVID. And by the way, the federal legislation clearly gives the federal government the power to make rules on interprovincial travel. If they don't do it, nobody else will do it. Public safety and health demands it. Okay, on that note, something tells me we'll be discussing this again in the future. I want to thank all three of you and wish you a happy and healthy weekend. Thanks for speaking with us.
Likewise. Take care, everyone.
Stay well, everyone.